You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, PhD candidate at Northwestern University studying Russian literature and film.
And I'm Cameron Lalana, a literature enthusiast and a guy working in media.
This is the podcast for people who want to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture. Every episode, we're going to be bringing you the background and analysis you'll need to know and understand these works.
If you're interested in supporting us, you can head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. All right, Matt, what are we getting into this week?
This week, the first film kind of covered on the podcast. The first film as such covered on the podcast. We've done adaptation, but now we're doing just film. We're going to be talking about Andrey Zvyagintsev Leviathan, the 2014 film that, took Cannes by storm, took a bunch of other film festivals by storm. I was looking just on Wikipedia. I think in the accolades section, I think it won like more than half, close to like 2/3 of the awards it was nominated for, which is pretty good sweep up if you ask me.
Right, yeah, I mean, it did well for itself.
Yeah, not too bad.
Right. And I'm excited to get into Leviathan. Anyone who's ever been in Slavic studies in college, except for Matt somehow, has had to. Yeah. I feel like has had to watch Leviathan like 3 or 4 times over. So I'm excited to talk about it, but also excited to talk about it because you spoke about this in another podcast not too long ago, a month or 2 back, I think, maybe 2 months back.
Yeah, I was on Dan Benamore's Watch List Tonight where we talked about Leviathan, and I had so much more I wanted to talk about, and so I said, hey, we can talk about it on my podcast too. But you should go listen to Dan's podcast in the show notes. It'll be linked. And we had a good conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So, Leviathan, before we get into talking about the film itself, let's give a little bit of background on our director here, or more specifically, where our director is taking inspiration from for this film, because it's an interesting one. It's an incident from the American canon, actually.
Yeah, Cameron's going to try to come at me for not having watched this in my program, but I was the one who told him what it was really about.
This is true. I did not know about this until Matt brought it to me, so that's turnabout's fair play.
Yes, so Zvyagintsev gets his inspiration from the 2004 incident, shall we call it, in the U.S., where Marvin Heemeyer rampaged through a small U.S. town using a modified bulldozer that he poured concrete on to secure himself. This was after a sort of land dispute with the government, or they're trying to, what do you call it? Not public domain is land. Eminent domain
eminent
is
domain,
land.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. I tried to public domain is land. It was for everybody. And he didn't like that, so he went on a complete rampage, and didn't end super well for him. He ended up killing himself inside the tank after he pretty much crashed into a hole, more or less. And so that's what this incident is. It inspires Leviathan, and Zvyagintsev said that he wanted to try to adapt it to a sort of Russian context. But so I think it'll be interesting to look at in what ways the small man versus the government is sort of this universal theme that transcends nearly all cultures.
Right. I think it's funny that we take this. I'll roughly call it an American incident of this guy going on a rampage. I think this typical American obsession with violence over a wrongdoing done to you, and then we have Zvyagintsev saying, "How do we make this Russian?" All right. So this guy's wife cheats on him. He's in total despair. Also, he gets accused of a murder, and then he doesn't get to do anything about it. That's the Russian equivalent here.
I guess we should mention maybe now, even though it's too late. It'll be a spoiler-filled episode. If you haven't seen the film, you should see the film before listening to this episode. Yes, you should do that. You should watch it. It's about 2 hours and 20 minutes. Even though that seems, well, actually, I guess given a lot of movies recently, that actually doesn't seem that long in comparison. But it's worth every second, even the quiet moments. Quiet moments make the loud moments all the more interesting. It's pretty well paced, I would say. I was watching this again just last night before recording this episode, and I was thinking that, like, on the first time I watched it, I was like, yeah, this is like a little bit slow, a little quiet. And now on the second time, I was like, no, everything's perfect. Everything is as it should be.
Well, I mean, it follows. It puts you in the right mindset of you're in this quiet, small town where very little actually happens other than, corrupt mayors trying to take your land. And so it's a lot of time spent staring out at the ocean or out at seabeds or beaches or at the broken down old rotting ships. And even without music, you just sit there and you stare. Because, I mean, a lot of the time when you're out in a rural area like that, what else is there to do?
Yeah, there's no background music going on in rural areas for sure.
Right. Actually, it immediately turns off when I drive out of town. It's weird.
Yeah.
I gotta look into that. But so let's talk about the film itself. As Matt mentioned, this will have spoilers. So if that bothers you, check out the movie first. You can find it anywhere. It's across many streaming services.
You can find it anywhere.
Just open up your internet browser of choice, type it in, go to Dailymotion.
Yeah, if you speak maybe Romanian, there seems to be a translated copy into there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. We assume it's Romanian on the basis that it looks like French but less comprehensible. So the film itself, we open up, as we mentioned, lots of landscape shots, and we come in and we join this kind of family in progress, populated by Father Kolya, Mother Lilia, who is an apparent second wife and stepmother to Kolya's son, Roma. And this is the comparison point with Marvin Heemeyer. So the government, or more specifically the mayor of their small town, which I don't think is ever named, just some rural...
Vadim.
Huh?
Vadim.
But no, sorry, the town is never named.
Oh, the town, yeah.
Yeah. So they're in the small rural, like, on the bay, full all these rotting docks still there, not much else. And, now Vadim, this mayor, wants their land, and they're losing the fight. So Kolya's old army friend, Dima, or Dmitry, is coming to help him out. He's a lawyer in Moscow. Dima arrives. He tells Kolya, all right, let's... After some tea and after some conversing, Dima kind of tells Kolya, oh, okay, I've got dirt on Vadim, a lot of stuff, horror show, which we never find out. It's not really that relevant, but, he's into something or other that's not above bar, I will say lightly. And Dima proposes, okay, look, I don't think this is going to go our way, but on the back end, we're going to take a more nuanced approach and then see where we can get from there. This kind of continues as we've got this family life as Dima involves himself. As Dima predicts, the first court hearing does not go well. The court rules against them. It basically gives them until the next morning to turn over their property, which is a process that gets stalled once Dima approaches Vadim, this corrupt mayor, and puts forth this blackmail. And it's where we leave that for now. At the same time this has been happening, Dima and Lilia have started a sexual relationship, which comes after I think Kolya he's when they're trying to put in a petition over some incidents that happen. Kolya gets not arrested, but he gets put in custody, and while that's happening, Dima and Lilia go back to have something to eat, which leads to them sleeping together. And that all kind of comes to a head the next day, or maybe even the day after that, when they all go out for a picnic to celebrate a birthday of a friend of Lilia's. And they all go out there and they decide, hey, it's a perfect birthday. 1, booze. 2, kebabs. 3, automatic firearms. So they go out to the middle of nowhere and start drinking heavily. I mean,
yeah,
seriously.
I wouldn't say booze. I would say like a tub full of booze.
Before they do anything, these 4 guys, they have an entire, I assume, 750 milliliter bottle of vodka. They got 4 cups. They fill up those 4 cups until the bottle is no more than drink it, and said, okay, time for us to handle firearms.
Time for us to really get started, please.
Right. So during this event, these guys are kind of rocking and rolling. The women are rolling their eyes and go off to make the kebabs, except for Lilia, who gets up and leaves. Dima, after a brief moment, very noticeably starts switching his cups with other people, so he's drinking less, then goes off in a similar direction, which leads to one of the kids that's involved later finding them having sex, and then you see these guys go running off, and lots of yelling, and then some gunfire. You might assume, did they kill Dima or Lilia? Next scene, no, they're back in, but they're beating the hell up. Mostly Dima, but you can see that Lilia is developing a black eye. And they go back to Dima's hotel. Dima and Lilia talk, and then Lilia goes back to Kolya in a pretty awkward moment for everyone involved. The next morning, Vadim shows up at Dima's hotel and says, hey, come on, get in, let's go talk. And as they go off, presumably to finalize the deal that Dima has been trying to put together for Kolya to either keep his land, or really what he proposes is Kolya gets much more money for the land than Vadim had proposed he be given for it as part of this eminent domain deal. Vadim then has his goons, again, beat the shit out of Dima. Not a good 2 days for him, and then puts him through a mock execution. The next day, Dima gets on the train, and that's the last time we ever see him in this film. After this point, we follow Kolya, Lilia for a little bit longer as they're packing up and getting ready to leave. Lilia, one morning, gets up, presumably to go to work. We follow the same motions as she has gone to work through before. Instead, she heads out to a cliffside, and then from that point forward, she's gone missing up until the point when her body is found. And Kolya has a breakdown, especially once he is accused of her murder. And the back half of the movie basically follows the process of him in grief, him being arrested by the police, his accusation being convicted by the court. And then finally, after he's been convicted, we follow through a sermon with Vadim, the corrupt mayor, who is listening to this priest who throughout the movie he's been talking to and who has been giving him advice. And we listen to this sermon and then see some more landscape shots. And that's where we leave the movie.
It's beautiful. It's hopeful. It's inspiring.
Yeah, that's hopeful is definitely how I would describe this movie.
No, it's bleak. It's a bleak boy.
It's a bleak boy. Just in terms of, just craft. This isn't. I just the way that I will say this movie conveys this bleakness and this emptiness through such wide shots, and just spending so much time sitting and watching these characters drive from one place to the other, or just staring off a cliff. It conveys a visceral sense of bleakness of very little, except for Dima, of course, a very little pressure or hurry to get anywhere, which I think sets it up well, especially for the back half. When the first half is very slow, the back half picks up to not actually a fast pace, but in comparison to the first half, the film almost feels breakneck at which things get thrown at you as a viewer.
Well, the whole, I think the first 6 minutes or so of the film, there's not actually any dialogue.
No.
It's just shots of things happening, and people walking around, cooking, eating. That is after like you said, those enormous, wide, establishing shots that are used to take in the sort of surrounding ocean and the beast within.
Right. And is there anywhere you want to start in particular? There's a couple things to go over here.
I wanted to start on the actual silence of the film.
Okay.
It is so quiet, the film. I don't think there is any music, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of the music is in film, happening within the environment of the film. A lot of the emotion of the film is conveyed through the sort of micro facial expressions of the actors, which I think are so phenomenal. And not to mention, not just silence, but how prosaic a lot of the film is, like you said. Most of what you're doing is just watching people in their daily life. Until about the second half of the movie when there's, blackmail and whatnot.
Right.
The slow burn water intro, this reminded me a lot of Solaris, personally. These sort of wide establishing shots kind of remind me of some of the cinematography from Tarkovsky. There are a few moments I think that are actually mimicked exactly from this film, but that is one that I started noticing immediately.
Speaking of silence too, semi-relatedly, as you mentioned, a lot of the emotion of the film comes through the facial expressions, the micro expressions, or even sometimes lack of facial expression from a character. And I think that's fascinating. I saw in a couple of reviews, I don't know if it was a criticism exactly, but the reviewers pointed out that there are a lot of characters especially Lilia, whose character motivations are pretty opaque. Not only do we not have her perspective, but we also don't have her saying much about it, if anything, really. But I think that's a bit misguided. I think the point of not only Lilia, she's, I think, the most obvious example, but to a certain degree, everyone's motivations are pretty opaque. People are everyone in this film is very reserved. They're all people who, for one reason or another, discomfort, or whatever the reason are, they don't really speak their emotions. And I think that's a great strength of the film, that we have all these people who, even to each other, are strangers to a certain degree. There is a lot which they don't convey to each other or won't say to each other, or you'll have long scenes where you'll see one character talking, or not, you'll hear one character talking, Kolya, and then it will be sitting on maybe Lilia. The camera will be sitting on Lilia, who's eating a tomato and just kind of staring half at him, half away. You've got this palpable sense of this relationship in this family, that there's, on camera or off camera, not a lot gets said. And I think that opacity, I don't know if it's the point, but I think the alienation from what each of these characters are actually feeling, with the exception of Kolya, who wears his heart on his sleeve, which again is more just showing through description, is a powerful thing. I mean, I think the only people who really kind of say what they're thinking are Pasha, the cop, and his wife, who are his wife. I forget. I don't know if her name is ever given. I believe it is at some point. She is the only one, and Pasha to a certain degree, the only one who really say what they're thinking. But also they're not part of the main family, which, then it's that very dynamic in the main family, which creates the whole situation, them being pushed away from each other. So I think that's a great strength of the film, not only in terms of how sound gets used, not diegetically, non-diegetically, just keeping the character motivations from us. I think that's a great strength.
I also think that when you kind of sometimes think about small town, rural, some of our association might be close-knit communities, and that is definitely not the case here. Like you said, it's very much a film of fracture, and not only thematically, but also in the way that a lot of the shots are structured, where the camera will be placed in a way where you as the observer are outside of the action, and you actually can't even hear the dialogue being said. People are talking because you can see their lips moving, but you don't hear anything. And so it struck me as so strange while I was watching this, where, for instance, in the first courtroom scene where the judge is just, like monologuing incredibly fast, reading off the history of the trial and everything, how it had come to that point. Well, the camera breaks off with somebody peeks their head in and realizes they're presumably in the wrong courtroom or whatever. And then the camera follows this random person out, and you get an extended shot of a woman crying in the hallway. Or while filing the petition, you are kind of behind that thick glass that the guards or whoever are behind, and you don't hear Vadim talking. Or not Vadim, sorry. You don't hear Dima talking. So you have a lot of these sort of situations, or even when Vadim and Dima meet, when you're outside the office, the camera is placed in such a way where you don't hear a lot of the dialogue that you're kind of like set up like you want to hear. Like some of these, what you would assume to be more explosive moments of dialogue, you don't always hear. Similarly, Dima's mock execution, right? For a large part of it, you're in the car with the music playing that's on in the car. So you're just kind of sitting there as a passenger, unable to really do anything. It kind of constrains you almost as the viewer. Sorry, I like that part of the film.
No, it's good. The cinematography is fantastic at both alienating you from the scene you're watching and also bringing you in with all these, like you mentioned, these shots which are from the point of view which can only have been through a theoretical person there. Like you're sitting in the front seat, or in that case, I guess it would have been the back seat of that car, of that SUV as you watch Dima being beaten. It's a fair number of shots are from that human eye view, which, as you point out, typically come with losing our full, like, I don't know what the term would generally be, like we have some sort of God's eye view into things. We hear all this dialogue, everything, but as soon as you jump into that human eye view, you start falling prey to things like sound not being able to travel through that barrier at the police station, for example.
Yeah, I think that's what that is. And in a lot of films, you kind of assume, right, like as the spectator, you're supposed to be able to see the central action, but not in this film. And it leaves a lot unsaid, and it also leaves a lot undone. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting approach to shooting it.
Right. And to your point about leaving things undone, I think that's another strength of the film in that it's trying to track I don't know if trying to track a life is an accurate way to describe it, but it's not. In a way, it's not telling a story as you might understand it. It doesn't have a lot of resolution. It leaves it open-ended. Characters, Dima, after being beaten and executed and threatened, you might say, okay, this is the moment when finally Dima is going to have his revenge. He's going to release that dirt on Vadim. He's gonna, they're going to win over this guy. But no, Dima just goes back to Moscow after he's threatened. And that's the last time you ever see him. And he just exits the movie after that. Sometimes
I kind of can't stand Dima, to be honest. On a second watch,
sure.
I think being coded as a lawyer in film, I mean, there's no coming back from that already from the beginning.
Right.
Just such a bad friend. Also, I feel like he's kind of like the I don't know, like to me he's almost like that sort of neoliberal character that you would assume most people would resonate with or root for. Right? He's well educated. He's the Moscow lawyer. He really believes in laws, or so he says. At one point, he says, "Oh, I only believe in facts," when asked about whether he believes in God. Yet, throughout the movie, he does essentially nothing with the law. The only way he accomplishes anything is also by blackmail, by working outside of official institutions.
Right. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting thing that he, as you say, he professes to believe in law, and when Kolya and Lilia are looking for reinforcement, like things are going to go well, he says, well, yeah, of course the law is the law, but I know how to help us work through it with the people in it. So despite, as you say, despite apparently believing that the law is actually something that really matters and not like it's a weapon of the government, which in this case it very obviously is, as you can see when the judge meets with the mayor and the mayor starts giving her orders on how things to be done, right? Dima also is very comfortable with the fact that he, as you say, is he's not working through law. He's working through people, working through networks, which by virtue of this being a small town, everyone more or less being connected, although not personally, they know each other to the extent that means anything. Well, he's both aware of the reality, but also posits to believe in a reality which doesn't exist, frankly.
Yeah, and I think he's kind of a, I don't know, sort of interesting character. He sets up like an interesting issue, which is a lot of times just people will say, well, to fix corruption, maybe you just need different laws, stricter laws, fairer laws, right? And it really starts to emphasize this core issue in the film about justice. And the idea of justice here is it's never going to be solved through the law. That's kind of the takeaway, I think, from part of the film, is that the law doesn't determine what is just. And there really is no recourse through, these official institutions to obtain anything just.
Right. So that's interesting. Do you mind if we for a second talk about the title of the movie, and then we can tie back to this point, because it is related. So Leviathan is, obviously a biblical creature, and it gets its most direct reference in the movie when, after Lilia's suicide, Kolya in mourning confronts this priest, who I think it's notable that he's the only priest who, there are only two priests, one of whom is a confidant of Vadim's and lives an expensive lifestyle. We're always seeing them eating, expensive meals. This priest, however, when we meet him, he is either just bought or he's received just a bunch of bread from a store and is putting it in a bag. And when Kolya asks him, if I believed in God, would that change anything? Would that bring my wife back? And the priest tells him, can you pull on the Leviathan with a fishhook or tie down its tongue with a rope? Will it keep begging you for mercy? Will it speak to you using gentle words? Nothing on earth is its equal. It is king over all that is proud. Which is an excerpt from the book of Job from chapter 41. Do you want me to, just for those of you who are not familiar with the book of Job, that's a book from the Old Testament, and the basic idea is that God's chilling. God's just chilling. Idea. And while he's chilling, he's hanging out, Satan approaches him. And Satan, if you are not really familiar with it in the Old Testament, carries an interesting role where Satan is used to refer to several different, sometimes people, sometimes celestial beings, in the sense that Satan in this case means accuser, and it plays different roles. It's not one singular character. In this particular usage, I believe the Hebrew is ha-Satan, meaning the kind of like the accuser. which seems to be kind of role, as some scholars have interpreted it. That's an interpretation of scholar, but it's not how I think that the New Testament, or once you get to the Christian Bible outside of the original Hebrew texts, Satan's to take on this singular celestial, fall from grace, angel, whatever. But in this case, the accuser really just is, the role here is to be like, hey, are things really how you think they are? And Satan tells God in this case, look, there is not a man alive who, if you did not take away everything that he had, no matter how much he professes to believe in you, would then curse you. And God says, no, my buddy Job here would never curse my name. And Satan says, well, why don't you take away everything he has? God says, bet. And then God kills all Job's kids and all his crops and all his animals. And then Job, through the book, Job maintains that he did nothing wrong. There's no reason for him to be punished, and Job has 3 awful friends who come in for the rest of the book, argue with him, and they're basically telling him, hey, Job, it is your fault. Until the end of the book, when God appears in a whirlwind and says to them all, you 3, you are bad friends. I curse thee. Job, just so you know, I totally did that to you, buddy. I am from whence all good and all evil comes. But you've never cursed my name, so here's some stuff. And throughout there, he also conveys how powerful he is by conveying all these creatures of the earth he's created, among which is the Leviathan. Now, I say all that because sometimes if you read reviews, this is impossible to avoid, the comparison of the entire movie to the Book of Job. Not only because it's named after a biblical creature, not only because it directly references Book of Job chapter 41, but it has some features in common as a story. And I've seen several times over, led people to say it's sort of, it's inspired by the Book of Job. It alludes to the Book of Job. I have some thoughts on that. We'll come back to that later because it's not relevant to this direct point. And I say all that because that is the most obvious interpretation of Leviathan, but there is an alternate interpretation of Leviathan as a meaning, which comes from the book by Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan. And in this case, Thomas Hobbes puts forth what's later comes to be known as contract theory, or a theory of how governance gets its legitimacy. And what Hobbes puts forth is that people naturally live in a state of nature. And as a corollary point, people are maximizers of their own pleasure. And when we live in a state of nature, what that means to Hobbes is there is nothing to constrain anyone's individual freedom. So in a state of nature, you have absolute freedom. But because humans are pleasure maximizers, they will try to gain the best possible of everything, and living among other people, that will necessarily mean butting up against the things that they want. And so not everyone will actually be able to get the best of all they want, because they'll be held and constrained by other people. And then that's where the place of a government, or as Hobbes terms it, a Leviathan, comes in to come in and restrict your individual rights. In exchange for that, it allows people to more or less get everything they need from society without actually without being able to go to the full extent they want, but because by limiting everyone's freedoms, they therefore allow everyone to enjoy them more fully, rather than some people getting to enjoy them a lot and a lot of other people getting them to enjoy a little bit. And so you give your freedoms to live in, to remove yourself from this state of nature. And that is the purpose that the government serves, to allow more people to have access to this. I bring that up because I think that's a more relevant comparison to this film than I think Job is. And I know that I think it would be a disservice to this film to reduce it just to a criticism of the Russian government, although it certainly is that. But I struggle with interpreting the Book of Job in relation to the film. But I think that the comparisons between talking about an ideal of governance as one in which your individual rights are limited, are limited in order to allow you to more fully enjoy, a broader spectrum of them, in relation to this reality where these rules and ideas are put in place. But in effect, what it does is just reifies what Hobbes might call the state of nature, where certain people who are in control of the levers are able to maximize their pleasure and minimize other people's. In effect, despite this Leviathan being in place, it effectively doesn't. It effectively only exists to prevent people from being able to struggle against this infringement upon their own freedoms and desires and such forth.
Yeah, I don't really know if there's a Leviathan in place in this film. You know what I mean? I feel like it's more closer to sort of like anarchic system.
I think that's the point. I feel like that's kind of how the film is bringing you in here, because it has the justice system, the government. They all have the features of the so-called Leviathan, but the reality of it is that each of these features are simply a weapon to maintain power. The court, I think it's interesting that we are only ever in court for the reading, as you pointed out, for the reading of a verdict. We are not in through any other feature of it. The only important feature of the court is what it says in the end. And what it says in the end, as the film posits, was always what it was going to say, because it's not a real court. It's controlled by people who are trying to maintain their power and understand that if they lose their power or lose their patrons, they will be shit out of luck. There's no help for them after that point. Someone else will use it against them. Yeah, so that's my mini rant. I'm going to come back to the Book of Job eventually, but I've been talking for a while. Is there anything you want to, any other topics?
I agree with your point on that it shouldn't be a reduction to just a critique of the Russian government. I think it is on many levels, but I also think it transcends that. It makes a broader point on the relationship between people, governance, and also God. I think the Book of Job is relevant, but I understand your point. I think Hobbes is also relevant. I think Hobbes is obviously there. I mean, that's a good comparison that a lot of people don't always talk about. Okay, this is a lot on Leviathan. I think now would be a good time for a break. We'll be back in just a second.
Hey, and if you want, because this is a podcast, if you haven't watched the film yet, you can pause it right here, go watch the film, and come back, having only spoiled
that would be genius.
Part of it. Yeah. Well,
having only spoiled the main action for you.
Right. But it's not about the main action, it's about the small things. Anyway, this episode was brought to you by us. You can support independent podcasting by heading to our website, slaviclitpod.com. You'll get access to the notes we used to make this episode, including links to all secondary sources mentioned.
If you want to support the show, but you don't want to spend any of those hard-earned doubloons, you can join our email list for free at slaviclitpod.com, or you can leave us a nice review wherever you get your podcasts.
Questions, comments, or maybe you want to appear on our Office Hours podcasts. Drop us a line. You can reach out. You can reach our voicemail at 209-800-3944. One more time, that's 209-800-3944. Or you can also email us a voice recording or text question at slaviclitpod@gmail.com. We'll bring your question onto the podcast and do our best to answer it.
All right, let's get back to the big fish.
Actually, I want to have a question for you, because the first time we talked about Leviathan, you told me, sorry, I know I'm springing this on you out of nowhere, but you told me that you think this film didn't do a great job making a critique of the modern Orthodox Church, and I wanted to understand that point a little better, because I'm curious as to what you meant by that.
I don't really remember what I meant by that, to be honest.
That's fair,
but I do have some thoughts on. Actually, I really do think that the Book of Job has a lot to do with the film, because I actually think a large portion of the film is a critique of organized religion more generally. I think it's a critique of just organizations, probably kind of centralized power in a lot of ways, because the contrast that you noted, I believe the priest that's advising Vadim is not a priest but actually a metropolitan, so I think he's in charge of this area in general, so he's higher up in the hierarchy, whereas this village priest, he's sort of on a lower rung, and in the sense it keeps him, he's a more honest priest. He's this sort of, almost like this Tolstoyan priest. I think that's sort of what the religious bent of the film is, to be honest. I think it's really it's actually really Tolstoyan in nature, in the sense that you can find God personally, not through organized religion. And I think that's the drive of the film, of what the film is saying. There's a few interesting points on this, and it'll tie back to our discussion of communities, I think, too. So there are two mirrored scenes in the film that I think are really important. There is people looking up at the cupola of the church. Now, up there's usually an icon, sometimes Christ. That's what's shown at the very end of the film, when Vadim's boy looks up and he sees Christ at the top of the church. When Kolya is in the abandoned church where his son drinks with his friends, and he's down there guzzling vodka, doing whatever he's supposed to do, and he looks up to the cupola of that church, it is disintegrated, and he can see directly through to the sky. Now, my interpretation of this is that the finished church that is closed off to this other world, whereas the disintegrated church is open to this world, and that is why the organization as such has no bearing on your access personally to God. Not my belief, what I think the film is saying. And I think that actually the reason that it takes place in this abandoned church is because Kolya's son, right, this is where his group of friends hangs out. I mean, they're a little bit degenerates, but at the end of the day, they're just teenagers, they're having fun.
Hey, also, hanging out with your buddies when you're in high school and just lighting a fire in like a disintegrating, gigantic church and just passing around a beer, that sounds awesome. I would do that right now for fun.
Yeah, my mom definitely would not have let me do that. But I guess it sounds fun, yeah. But yeah, so that's kind of the only example of like a functioning community that I could point to in the film. And they're kind of like accountable to each other, because when Kolya's asking about his son, like the kids know like where he went and kind of what everyone is up to. And right, so I think it's no coincidence that that is sort of the replacement for the church, right? It's the linkages of that community. And I think that is one way that you can interpret the film. I think the reason that I said this is not a great critique of the Orthodox Church, right, is as this corrupt priest at the end is giving his sermon, and I can't remember exactly what he says. He says something to the effect of like, God sees everything. Well, I think like most people in the Orthodox Church would agree that what he's doing is not right, and that God will see that and judge that as well, because there was a metropolitan interviewed. I believe the one actually that was in charge of the region of where the city that the film is based off of. And journalists were asking him, like, don't you think this is a mockery? Don't you think this is a disgrace? Because a lot of Orthodox people in Russia were upset when this came out. And basically he said, like, hey, if there's corruption and this film is, shedding a light on it, then, good. It should. There shouldn't be, this shouldn't be happening in the church. And so I don't really see it personally as this big, gotcha moment. I think that there are obviously, issues, but I don't know that I would necessarily, go so far as this radical Tolstoyan reading, personally. To say that no religious organization has any merit or is like completely unneeded, I think that is pretty radical. Sure.
Which, I don't think is what this film is saying.
You could read it that way, I think. I don't know if it's 100%,
Well, I think that by virtue of having priests in comparison to the church, it seems to reinforce an idea that there is a positive form of religion, which is not really like based on the church, which is where I start getting to that Tolstoyan element. There's not a complete lack of redeeming features of religiosity in this film. It's just that everything associated in this film with the organized Orthodox Church there is just coded as part of this power structure, which can is meant to carry itself forward.
Mm-hmm.
Right, when like Vadim is trying to talk to the priest, not the priest, the metropolitan, the metropolitan about what's going on. The metropolitan says, "Look, what is it? Don't tell me the details. I'm not your confessor." Which I mean, is like both funny because in one sense he's right, but in another sense, it's an interesting sleight of hand to avoid any legally knowing anything.
There is also this really good scene, I think, in part of that with Vadim and the priest, where I don't know if it actually shows it on the film, but I'm pretty sure they're drinking vodka together, which is not necessarily impossible to happen, right? But so it seems to me to indicate the sort of desecration of the icon that is on the wall behind them blurred. If you're paying close attention, there's a large icon of the Last Supper, and it is mimicked exactly the way that they're sitting, kind of at the table together. And, as they're toasting and talking about, essentially doing whatever needs to be done, wink, wink, in order to build this new church on stolen land, you see this icon behind them. It is sort of this desecration I see, personally. I thought it was just one of those, it was just like a really good touch, because it was one of those that's like, it's really not in your face. The fact that it was not in focus while the scene was being shot, I thought was wonderful.
Speaking of religion, I'm going to take it back to. Sorry, I'm going to get back on my high horse for a second. I want to talk about the Book of Job. And I understand your point that it is relevant to the film, but I think in general, leaning too hard in the Book of Job more obscures the film. I think the film lives more on its own life, and it really like falls in the shadow of the Book of Job because
that's true.
Yeah, I like just the lessons of the book are not that they're not relevant to the film, but it takes and chooses, which is fine. It takes elements that it wants, and it leaves behind a lot of other elements. Well, like in the Book of Job, it's entirely the character of Job going through all these trials and tribulations, has friends saying it must be your fault. And then there's this other guy, Elihu, shows up to deliver a message. And my hot take is that Elihu should not be read as part of the Book of Job. I know this is controversial among scholars. I think Elihu was added later. That's my hot take. Because he shows up, he's never mentioned before or after. God immediately shows up after Elihu, addresses everyone there except for Elihu for some reason, and also contradicts Elihu. So I don't know. It feels weird as a piece of literature to have that. But anyway, God shows up at the end and curses everyone for saying it must be Job's fault. And he's like, no, I totally did that. I am from where all good and from where all evil comes from. I am all powerful. Let me show you how powerful I am. And then he restores everything to Job. Job never curses God out. And I think it's notable that in this case, although Kolya could be read as someone who is cursing God, especially when he's at this priest and he's confronting him and he says, hey, if I start believing, would that have changed anything? Would believing bring my wife back? And the priest keeps telling him, I don't know. I don't know what goes forward. But then he conveys to him the story of Job. I think there's certain parallels in the way that Kolya actually is never like in rejection of a God, which is I think, if I recall correctly, the only unforgivable sin, really. Pretty much anything else could be forgiven. I don't know if that's just an interpretation that came through the church I was raised in, but there are parallels, but I think overall, like, the messages diverge so much, it's just not a very helpful frame of reference, really, other than picking and choosing some of its features and some of its themes. At the end, Kolya, of course, nothing is restored to him, at least at the time the film ends. That doesn't mean nothing ever will, and it's not like a contradiction or anything, as God points out, if we were to accept that, good things can come from this Hebrew God, also the bad things come from him. So it's not... I don't know. I think the film just lives too much in its own right to fall within the shadow of Job too much, other than some allusions, is my hot take.
Well, I think that's fair. It's not like it's supposed to be like a recreation of the Book of Job necessarily, but I do think that how you feel in relation to the Bible probably impacts the ending of the film.
Right.
Whether you see it as containing any hope at all, or whether you see it as bleak, this film shows us that there is no hope for us, for humanity, and we should all just, I don't know, essentially kill ourselves. There's literally nothing, you're right, there's nothing for us to do. I mean, that would be the conclusion that you would have to lead to, right, if you don't believe in an afterlife, right? If you don't believe in the possibility of some sort of redemption like that. That's how I would think. That's how I would think it would lead, right? We're
really getting into... I feel like the ghost of Albert Camus is emerging from his grave. Well, yeah. So the ending... I think... Well, so towards the ending, I can move it slightly. I want to talk about... And I don't want to lean too much on individual symbology as like this is going to decode the film. But do you think that the whale skeleton that's featured throughout the film is interesting?
Do you think it's interesting, the whale skull?
I think it's interesting only in relation to the fact, and I don't think it tells you anything super deep about the film, but it's interesting that for most characters, you only experience this whale as a skeleton, except for Lilia, who presumably in the moment before her suicide sees a whale diving. So the one time you see a live whale in relation to this whale skeleton, it's just before the suicide. I don't have anything to...
no, you see it at the beginning of the film, too.
Oh, okay. There you go. It's 2 times.
In the water.
So, yeah, all right. So twice you see
Busted your theory, huh?
Well, I don't really have a theory. I don't know. I don't have anything to make of that. I just think it's interesting that that's the symbolism used of the having something alive only comes before the suicide. I don't know what that means necessarily, but I feel like they're trying to convey something with it.
Well, it's few, I guess, interpretations you could have. There's like one thing that I thought was interesting, and it's before Lydia dies, she's working like gutting and cleaning fish, basically. And the comparison of the fish processing compared to the skull of this like magnificent, now dead wild animal, I thought was just like was excellent. I thought that was supposed to be drawn as a comparison. But I would also say that in general, right, like in the Orthodox world, the idea of like the heavens and earth as like separate places that are, right, like not, I don't know how you say it, like not reachable from within each other. Like they're completely separate. They have essentially nothing to do with each other. You just transfer from one to the other at the end if you were good, right? Like that, it doesn't work like that. Like they're combined. They're more integrated, right, in Orthodox thought. And so whether this is the whale or, right, this old biblical beast, right, I think that's one way that you can kind of think about it. That there is this otherworldly maybe presence within the world, even though it does seem so hopeless. I don't want to read the film as too hopeless, actually, personally.
Interesting. Tell me more.
I just personally don't want to.
No, all right, that's fair.
It's not like I've analyzed and decoded and I think it's this. It's I personally don't want to. I would be too depressed if that was right, if that was the interpretation of the film.
Yeah.
I think that it's sort of, I don't know, like characters like Dima, I wonder like how they end up. Mr. I only believe in facts.
Right.
Like where does he fit in this world?
Well, I think that when I approach this, the fact that I kind of approach it the same way towards the end when Kolya is accused of having killed his wife. He's sat down in front of presumably some kind of police detective or sergeant. The sergeant.
Dude, that man has like such strange proportions too. He's like, that guy is all shoulders.
He looks like he has to be like one of those guys who's like 7 feet tall, and you're like kind of sit there.
He looks like a Tim Burton character, actually.
I just get the sense that if he stood up out of the chairs in the entire time, he'd just like suddenly unfold and would be like 7 feet tall. But he tells Kolya that, okay, we recovered her body. We found there's a hammer mark in the back of her head. And right, we assume, and given that it seems like she had sex before she died, we're going to investigate this as a rape and murder. And on when you were on the what is it? Watch This Tonight. I think you posited that this is meant to be kind of an allusion to kind of Stalinist show trials. I think that's right. I think that's right for the most part. For some viewers, that may bring up the question. I think the question of, oh, maybe he did kill his wife. Maybe that's something that did happen. I don't personally think that text leads you to believe anything but what you said, that it's meant to be kind of an allusion to show trials. But I think there's a lot of features of this film which, if you consider them on their own right, I don't think it matters. Like the fact that Dima shows up, tries to help, fucks up, and then leaves. The fact that we don't know where Kolya's story goes. The fact that I don't think we should even try to answer whether or not he was even involved in his wife's death. All these features of the story, I think, don't need to fit neatly in because all these characters themselves don't fully understand. They're as lost as we are a lot of the time. And I think because Leviathan reflects an experience of life so well in not only having ends to characters' storylines that doesn't have a typical story end. It doesn't have necessarily a meaning. It just, this character just got too scared, got too beat up, and he left. He's gone. And sometimes that's how it goes in life. Sometimes we don't know what comes next. Sometimes we don't know what the people around us are thinking. We as a viewer are very much integrated, I think, as if we were a character too. And so much doesn't make sense. And I think I feel like that's a feature of the story that doesn't need to go together. That it's just, we're experiencing part of a life and all of its messiness that comes with it, and all of its lack of denouement, of conclusion, and idea where it's meant to go. Good or bad, whatever comes next, by virtue of being as locked in this time and place as the characters are, that's simply not for us to know. That's something that's going to happen on its own pace. I don't know. That's how I read it. Some of these features.
Yeah, my problem with Dima Moore is just I feel like his worldview is incompatible with the world in which he actually lives. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh no, I think your point that he's got that kind of that I guess I would roughly call it like a liberal mindset of like kind of believing in the system all the time. Clearly, on some level, knowing how things really work. That this
right.
idea of governance, this idea of law is sort of a fiction meant to hide the fact that they do what they want.
Right. It actually, I don't know, this film really reminds me of Gogol, and Pushkin described Gogol's artistic method once as laughter through tears of sorrow. And to me, you gotta have kind of a messed up sense of humor like myself, but this one's pretty funny to me, actually. There's a lot of moments of comedy in this film, between the way things are shot and the just perverse symbolism that occurs in different spots. But there are a lot of moments, I think, of humor. You just have to be looking for them.
Right.
And you probably have to have a screw or two loose. I don't know.
It's a very bleak form. It's a form of humor where I think you're in a situation and everything is so fucked. It's so impossible for you to solve what's going on here that all you can really do is laugh, because that's like, fuck it, I'm gonna laugh or I'm gonna cry, and I guess
or both at once.
Right? Yeah, both these things might be happening.
Yeah. Now there is one scene that I did want to talk about towards the end. I love the scene where his house is getting destroyed, where Kolya's house is getting torn down. I just thought that was like that must have been such a cool shot to like film and do and everything. It reminds me of like this sort of modern version of Matryona's house by Solzhenitsyn. This sort of destruction of the pristine rural countryside in some ways. And it was just kind of, it's like an interesting parallel I was thinking about while I was watching again. But during that scene, there is a shot that is mirrored. I believe this was from Solaris by Tarkovsky. In Solaris, there is, and in Leviathan, there is the shot of rain falling on food and cup. And this seems kind of like, sort of like, this is like so specific. What do you care? But it's a long shot, and it's a long shot in both of them. And I feel like there are, I don't have it fully worked out, but if you are going to include a long shot that almost directly mirrors the way that it works in another major filmmaker within your own nationality, right? Or even in just like world cinema, since Tarkovsky is like widely considered one of the greatest filmmakers of all times, then in that case, it does become significant, right? And to me, right, this cup, it is symbolic of Matthew 26, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And right, so this is what is like so significant about the ending to me, that this scene occurs in the destroyed house of Kolya, right? And so the ending of the film, I think, like, I don't know if you can if you read it as this like sort of acceptance of God or not. I think like whether, like, depending on how you view that will again like directly influence whether you think this is a bleak film or a film with hope of redemption. And I think that being placed so close to the end is really important. And I can find the two, like the screen grabs for people if they're interested, because it was, we're going to talk about Solaris at some point. I got like 3 hours of stuff to talk about with Solaris.
So we just got away from doing multi-month series on books, but we will be doing a multi-month series just on Solaris, so I hope you're ready for that.
No, it's going to be one episode. It's going to be like 8 hours long.
No editing on that one. It's just stream of consciousness.
That would be fun, actually.
That would be interesting. I think, is there anything, I feel like I talked about most of what I noticed in the film. Is there anything you want to cover before we head out?
Just one last thing. You got to bear with me on the God stuff. I really do think it's important here. I think it's important, but I think it also, I'm not really sure, like I said, if it comes down on a side. I think that's what to me is so like artistic with the film, it does depend on you, like how you feel, which is, it's fun. But we talked a lot about silence, and there is a really important passage from the Book of Kings in Orthodox theology about where you find God. And I just wanted to read it, give you a little food for thought on my personal theory on, why is the film quiet? I think it's a theological thing, personally. So this passage is, "Then the Lord said, 'Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. The Lord will pass by. There was a strong and violent wind rending the mountains and crushing the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire, a light, silent sound. When he heard this, Elijah hid his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of a cave. a voice said to him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" And so this idea of finding God in silence, in like kind of mellow contemplation, I think is really important for the film, because the film is shot in this sort of almost, right, like silent contemplative mode. I would say that's kind of what permeates the film as a whole. And so, right, like it might not be a one-to-one like comparison with the Book of Job, but to me it takes that core spiritual issue of Job and it kind of expands on it, or explores it.
I see your point.
So I'm more Book of Job than Hobbes, personally.
That's fair. I guess to your point about how you view the world might also reflect how how you come away from this story.
Now, if you don't care about religion, then this film, I think, is what might be more interesting to you through like the lens of Hobbes, for instance. Not saying you personally, but like viewers, like it might be a more like interesting political issue. I think, though, this discussion shows that to reduce it to look at Russian government funny, it does bad thing, like that, like you got to be like brain dead. Like that is not the take that you should have. I mean, yeah, it is a take, and it's too simplistic, right? Like it does have a lot of things, don't get me wrong, that are like very provocative. That even it's like some lines of dialogue, I'm like, it's a little surprising, but it's not right. Like I almost don't feel like that was the point, 100%. And so to just reduce it to that is kind of like, I don't want to read one of those on Twitter again.
Yeah, no, it's not just that, and it would be silly to reduce it to that. I'm full agreement that dealing with spiritual issues is a core feature of this film. I think part of it, we've talked about this previously, part of that tendency just comes from this sort of desire from non-specialists to understand like quote unquote, big quotes here, dissident culture from other places. And all dissident culture tends to get lumped into either you're pro-government or you're anti-government. And that gets into things where you're like, Dr. Zhivago, the Gulag Archipelago, Master and Margarita, those are all equivalent dissident literatures, which doesn't allow for the actual variety of like difficult relationships that people might have with a place or a government, or like, any of the actual issues that in individualities that might come into this, right? Like the fact that I don't know this for certain, but I suspect there's not a whole lot of overlap between, like, I don't know, Solzhenitsyn and well, there's some overlap in Solzhenitsyn and Bulgakov, especially in relation to the white guard, but like, Solzhenitsyn is not an equivalent dissident to, I don't know, what's his name, Mendeleev, the dissident Soviet historian. I'll put his name in the show notes, but yeah, it's part of this desire that comes, I think, from not really understanding the full range of opinions, and so to reduce it to that is I think part of a larger trend of unfortunate tendencies among media criticism that is led at other cultures, especially because once you leave, then all you can be is a dissident, and you got it right. Number of people who left the Soviet Union only to die in obscurity, or in poverty, because people stopped caring after a while about their dissident literature, and that was all they were interested in reading in the first place. So
that's kind of why I think that this is it's a good film you should watch if you haven't watched it yet. We've probably spoiled the crap out of it, but just like, because it's about more than Russia. And so I think that's what connects it, right, also to good literature of Russia, like the Golden Age, right? It's this sort of spiritual exploration.
Yeah.
I think that's what the film kind of also maintains. And it's much harder to chew on, and it's much harder to think about that angle than it is just the government's bad.
Yes.
Which, that's not worse. No one said that here, but other people have said that. So
yeah, which is a strength of the film, that you can, how much there is to root around it, and how much your individual perspective coming in will affect how you see this film. Really worthwhile. I mean, frankly, there's a lot of this film we basically, even in this hour, didn't even get to cover so much of the relation between Kolya and Lilia, which I think is I'm not even certain you can really talk about it that much. I feel like that's something that has to be explored and felt more than really can be talked about. But yeah, that you should watch it.
Why not?
So much.
Why not? You don't have to wrap up. You can keep going.
No,
I can keep going.
We can just keep going forever. But yeah, you can. There's a lot that we can. There's still to be found even outside of our discussion.
Yeah, my closing thought that I kind of wanted to end on was this article that I read by Russian critic Dmitry Bykov, who asked this question in a review or article on Leviathan. Is it really the authorities' fault that all of the characters in the picture hate each other, drink like hell, don't believe in anything, and just endure everything? And that to me is kind of the main point, or a main point of the film, right? Is in why it can't just be a critique of government, because changing the government does not change the outcome of this film. Right? The fact that it's set in a provincial, rural, it shouldn't be read as just like a Putin allegory, right? Like, it's a commentary on like people. And you can switch out Vadim, but you're going to get someone who does the same exact thing. And right, in that sense, it's actually not really the government's fault, right? It's more of a feature of power and centralization. So that was an interesting quote that I ran across.
Yeah. I think that's...
Cameron didn't like it. He died. I just heard it.
No, yeah. I think that's a good place to leave it. I like that. I think that's a good question to leave it on. All right, Matt, before we completely wrap up, I have to ask you, what are we tackling next time?
Next time, we're going to be reading the short story, The Performance by Sergei Dovlatov. If you are planning on reading along with us, be sure to pick up a copy through our affiliate links on our website. To help keep our show independent and for exclusive access to the notes containing all of the research that went into this episode, head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. And before we let you go, we want to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current supporters.
Yes, and that would be my, it's spelled M-Y. If that's not what you want to have at the end here, just let me know through Discord or through email, or just change it on the website. My, Daniel, Lou, Gary, Janice, Ann, Isaac, Emily, Caitlin, Yitza, Irini, and Packrob. The music used in this episode was Staraya Kino by Peremotka. You can find more of their stuff on Bandcamp or Spotify. The spelling and links are in the show notes.
You'll hear from us again soon.
Hey, 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 hey.